Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to talk to you about psychologization, some philosophical reflections. So Paula has already discussed its history, and Ronja, its prevalence and forms that it takes in relation to long COVID, and Georg has talked about why it happens, psychologically conceived at least. So I will quickly reflect on what it does mean to speak of psychologization in this context from a ethical and a social and political philosophical point of view. Here I will particularly focus on the critique of medicalization, whereby supposedly non-medical problems enter into the terrain of medical science, and its flip side is psychologization. The overemphasis or exaggeration of the role of psychological factors in illness, or the overspill of psychological discourse into non-psychological areas. Perhaps on first sight, after years of a critique of medicalization, it appears somewhat strange. How can long COVID demand, in their activism, to be medicalized? How can that be? Was medicalization not always what we wanted to get rid of? Did all those years of scholarship not show that medicalization is bad, a thing to avoid? Yet the current patient activism for medicalization is a demand for recognition amongst a patient group that has been historically psychologized. So how can this be, and what does it mean for us philosophers? First, I think that it should encourage us philosophers to critically reflect on perhaps some of the implications of our critique on medicalization. For within philosophy, and certainly since Michel Foucault, there is a strong tradition of critique on the medicalization of illness and also health, and the ways in which bodies and populations are managed through a biomedical objectivizing view. The argument, crudely put, is that the objectivating view of medicalization is problematic because it adopts an objectivating, pathologizing lens that categorizes people into functional, dysfunctional, or normal and abnormal binaries, but also biochemically and biomedically dissected human beings into organs, molecules, and bodily processes, or rather, people were turned into things. In other words, nothing much remained of the human subject and their subjective and intersubjective experiential world. And so within philosophy and also anthropology, sociology, and even politics, the critique of medicalization is prevalent, aimed at the liberation of the human subject from these objectivating confines of medicine. Now, of course, these critiques have a point, and medicalization does occur and it does have its drawbacks. I'm not saying that the arguments against medicalization are invalid as such. However, two issues stand out here, namely that those who argue against medicalization often do so from a position of relative medical privilege, namely the implicit assurance that should the need arise, doctors would help them, and that basically they would use the latest biomedical developments to do so. So there is, of course, a point here about those who criticize medicine for its medicalization, that they might very well end up relying on the developments in biomedical science that they would otherwise criticize under the label of medicalization. Long COVID patients do not have this assurance, but this is not my main point here. Perhaps more importantly, the critique on medicalization, perhaps also unintentionally, has a flip side. It can give rise to, or at least implicitly support, the problem of psychologization, and thereby deny the objective physical, immunological, cardiological, hematological reality that many patients find themselves in. And so, whilst medicalization arose out of a progressive need to liberate people from the restrictive confines of medical science, it can easily turn into or contribute to its opposite, namely the psychologization of illness, wherein illness is a social cognitive construct influenced by our thoughts with deeply conservative consequences. And this problem particularly arose with the rise of and increasing popularity of the biopsychosocial model, which was boosted in the 1970s and particularly also in the 1980s and in the early 2000s, by the UK government to cut spending on disability benefits. Here, the UK government, adopting a neoliberal approach, looked with suspicion to chronic illnesses and those with disability. And when one reads these texts on the biopsychosocial model, it becomes apparent that underlying these texts is a strong belief in the myth of the strong, autonomous individual subject who is at least capable of exerting full control over his or her life, is able to make it if he or she or them tries, and if not, well, they must be faking it. Disabled people were, above all, lazy and ill-intended. And so the idea arose that, especially in the absence of clear disease markers or in the situation of unexplained symptoms, patients suffering from chronic illness were not suffering from a medical condition or objective disease, but rather a subjective experience of illness that they themselves were not only held responsible for, but also was supposedly maintained through malingering laziness and false illness perception or false illness beliefs. And so the idea is that they do this for illness gains, mostly in the form of benefit payments, but also social attention. And the idea was that through the alteration of cognitive thoughts of their false illness beliefs, and thus no longer listening to one's sick body, but persisting through it, and increased exercise, that these people would get out of their lazy, illness-maintaining attitude, and, of course, of the benefits role. Then, in the 1990s also, of course, you see the rise also of the positive psychology model, which also really gives this, a boost, or is a swing to it, because it also emphasized that one can change one's reality through one's perception of it, and that one can make it if one tries. Crudely put, positive psychology holds the belief that if I think that the mud is purple, it is purple, despite it being dark brown. Of course, this is a philosophical Pandora's box. After all, what is perception and what is reality? But that is an alley that I will close off for now. Because what is important here is that post-viral and and particularly MHCFS patients bore the brunt of this. Though MHCFS differs in gradations, most or many of MHCFS patients were so severely ill after a virus, fungal, or bacterial infection that they often disappeared into dark rooms, unable to move. Now, this could not be true, and these patients were labeled as suffering from the yuppie flu, as being lazy and not willing to work. They were, in other words, stigmatized. And so they were subjected to cognitive behavioral therapies and gradual graded exercise therapy that resulted in an immense amount of harm. Not only did patients start to internalize guilt on top of their suffering, as they were now held psychologically responsible for their illness, but they were also being pushed to go beyond their exertion tolerance. This meant that their physical state deteriorated, and the medical harms done by those who adopt a biopsychosocial model ought to be recognized. It resulted in adding insult to injury, in the form of the internalization of guilt. The patients were told that they were themselves to blame, but also in placing children outside their homes, as parents were regarded as the illness-sustaining factor. But also even the death and severe deterioration of post-viral and post-bacterial and post-infectious patients. So here I'm, for instance, thinking of Maeve O'Neill, where was the case of last year in the courts. In such cases, patients are, for instance, withheld food and drink, which was placed outside of their reach, so that they were forced to get up to go and get it. Of course, they could not. Or, if they did, they worsened as a result. Here, I'm also thinking of Millie and Carla in the UK last year, whose medical care was withheld and whose situation deteriorated so gravely as doctors, unknowledgeable or unknowable of their disease, mistreated them by insisting it was a psychosomatic or psychological disorder and sectioned them using the Mental Health Act, despite all the medical evidence on her file. If patients did not die directly as a result of their worsening state, many become at a heightened risk of suicide. For a life in a dark room with eye covering and earplugs in is for many, quite understandably so, not a life at all. But not only that, there was also another consequence in that the psychosomatization of post-viral illnesses also halted the development of biomedical research into post-viral illness. After all, that was not needed if the source was in the mind or the brain or the ill intention of the will. And the effects of this we still feel to this day. Now, as one of the doctors that I know in Germany recently told me, this is just bad science. After all, really, our history is full of a great deal of illnesses that were, initially not proven until later on they were. So think of, for instance, the MRT scan. There were a great variety of illnesses that were later on objectively proven by the MRT scan. And these illnesses did exist before they were physiologically proven. Or rather, putting this point differently, just because there is currently no objective proof, although in the case of long COVID, ME/CFS, and post-viral illness, there actually is an increasing amount of medical proof. But say, even if there isn't, it doesn't mean that it's not real. Rather, it just means that the physical is not proven until that point, and that we might not have the appropriate means to prove those physical conditions. Although, again, within the context of long COVID, ME/CFS, MCAS, and all these related disorders, there is, of course, a growing literature on this. But here also we have to think of the fact that both AIDS and Lyme were ascribed to psychological and psychosocial disorders prior to proper medical developments that showed otherwise, that showed that they were medical. And even now there is the odd scholar that wants to claim that AIDS is psychosomatic. There is a lot of epistemological violence at stake here, namely of not taking the patient seriously when they say that something is wrong. And I'm sure that we will expand on this in the section with Charlotte Blees and the patient activist group Niet Hersteld. But also philosophically, I think this raises a number of questions. Firstly, we might want to start reflecting on the limits of the rather popular critiques of medicalization and explore, as the German philosophical tradition of the Frankfurter Schule taught us, how something that appears liberatory and emancipatory might in fact give rise to its opposite. So the critique of medicalization might have deeply violent consequences. Secondly, we might also want to consider how psychologization is also connected with the emphasis on the myth of the strong individual autonomous subject, to whom responsibility can be ascribed, which is particularly popular within this neoliberal economic context, as it is cost reductive, well, at least in the short term. And then thirdly, we might also want to consider how this is closely embroiled with the increasing neoliberalization of healthcare that is focused on cost efficiency and sugar-coated on the banners of patient resilience, self-management, and personalized medicine, wherein individual patients are increasingly made self-responsible for their health and the harms it might do. Fourthly, we might want to consider how particularly notions of self-management and self-resilience are also deeply problematic in the context of severe post-viral chronicity, wherein patients, including children, are entirely bedridden, find themselves isolated for months and years in dark rooms with eye covers and earplugs in, as a sound, sight, as well as touch might make their illness so much worse. We might also want to recognize that such severe chronic illness entails the experience of submission, a sometimes temporary but often structural imprisonment of the will by the incapacitated body. It is not for no reason that patients often complain of being imprisoned in their body. And such bodily imprisonment directly shreds to pieces the Enlightenment and certainly neoliberal illusion that our will directs our self or our self-manifestation, or rather that the will leads the way, or as we say in Dutch, waar een wil is een weg. And rather, the will has has the well-functioning body as its precondition. And it's precisely this body that is thrown in pieces, lying in tatters on the floor or in bed. And the trouble is that as the emphasis in the biopsychosocial model, in its own texts and practices, has been on the individual will, on the reshaping of the will through pressure, there is no wonder that this has led to a great amount of suffering because it denied its corporeality. And so I think that the philosophical challenge long COVID and post-viral chronicity poses runs very deep. For like many other illnesses, it shatters through the mythic illusion of the strong individual making his, her, or their way in life. But given its infectious origins, it also raises questions about what structural or institutional resources we actually need to even carry out our autonomy. That is, infectious origins and deep vulnerable reliance upon others further impress upon us how violent essentialist conceptions or ideas of individual responsibility and autonomy really are. Autonomy is not something that is essentially given to us. It is not something that we already have and that is just to be carried out by the will, but rather it is created through social and political structures that recognize our shared embodied vulnerability. And this, of course, is also something that Professor Dr. Jamal Sharon will address in her talk on our chapter on invisibility and solidarity. Thank you very much.